Thank you, Mr. President. We are here at a historic moment. The President of the United States will come before us for his first State of the Union tonight, at a time when there is a credible case of obstruction of justice against him and an overwhelming case to show that the campaign that elected him was aided and abetted by the Russians. But the immediate threat is even more dire. Yesterday was a new low for the House Intelligence Committee. The House Republicans, in an act of partisan gutter politics, voted to release a 4-page misleading and deceptive characterization of warrants submitted to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. This partisan gutter politics brings us to a dark day of character assassination, much like the McCarthy days, when members of this chamber were counted in history as to whether they stood up and spoke out against this kind of smear campaign. Not only is there character assassination at work here, but also equally dangerous to our democracy, the potential compromising of sources and methods vital to our national intelligence and our national security. And that is the reason that President Trump's own appointee at the Department of Justice, Stephen Boyd, stated that the release of this memo would be, quote, extraordinarily reckless, end quote. Those words come from a former staffer for a Republican Congresswoman and then Senator Jeff Sessions, hardly a Democratic partisan. Extraordinarily reckless. Why? Because this memo, 4 pages long, summarizing a warrant that typically is tens or hundreds of pages, will reveal sources and methods that are vital to the continued operation of our intelligence community. My colleague, Senator Whitehouse, has very powerfully and eloquently stated why this development is so threatening and so deeply troubling. But my Republican colleagues are apparently averse to listening to this kind of reasonable and sensible need for caution. They are about to ask the President to defy his own Department of Justice and disclose this memo. Now, let's be very clear. I am one of the leading advocates in this body for transparency and disclosure. In fact, I believe strongly that all of the transcripts of interviews before the Judiciary Committee on the obstruction of justice investigation should be disclosed, and all of those witnesses should be called before us in open hearings, under oath, to tell their story so the American public can understand what happened. And I am in favor of challenges to warrants in the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that may be defective or fallible. In fact, I was the leading advocate and drafter of a provision in the law now that provides for challenges to those warrants. It does so within the bounds of confidentiality that are necessary to protect our secrets and our national security. And what the House Intelligence Committee and potentially the President of the United States are about to do is essentially defy the law and end run it so as to avoid the need for secrecy and confidentiality when it comes to intelligence gathering vital to our national security. There is a procedure for challenging warrants when they are fallible. The House Republicans are refusing to follow it, and they are also refusing to provide any rebuttal to the distortions and mischaracterizations in that 4-page memo. Here's the reality. The United States was interested in Carter Page, who was viewed by the FBI as a Russian agent well before the 2016 presidential campaign. In fact, their interest dates back to 2013, well before the Steele dossier, well before the election, when Russian operatives sought to recruit him as a spy. I'm going to repeat it. The FBI thought Carter Page, who became a Trump campaign official, was an agent of the Russian government. That's a stark public truth. That in and of itself would have been enough to obtain a FISA warrant to surveil him. Remember, he doesn't have to be convicted. He doesn't have to be proven a spy beyond a reasonable doubt. It is the probable cause standard and sufficient suspicion that he's a Russian spy that provides the opportunity legally and indeed the obligation to do surveillance. And we know also that European and other intelligence agencies, including from the UK, Netherlands, Germany, France, Poland, Estonia, and Australia, all discovered interactions between Trump's inner circle and Russian intelligence beginning in 2015. In fact, the Australian government told the FBI that George Papadopoulos bragged to an Australian diplomat over drinks at a bar that Russia had, quote, political dirt, end quote, on Hillary Clinton while he was working for the Trump campaign. And we know also that the Dutch government informed the FBI of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election through hacking. And we know that Carter Page openly traveled to Moscow to give a pro-Russian speech. And we know he met with Russian officials just as the Kremlin was working to undermine the 2016 election. The purpose of releasing this memo is to create, very simply, a false narrative, a distraction, a red herring, call it whatever you wish. Its purpose is to discredit and degrade the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice, law enforcement agencies that deserve the American people's support. No matter who they are investigating, as long as they are doing it objectively and dispassionately, as they are doing here. Republicans conveniently ignore the facts. Not only the facts that I have just recounted, facts that are declassified, but also facts that they know well, facts that may be continued to be classified. A 4-page memo simply cannot accurately summarize what is typically 100 pages or more in a FISA warrant application without cherry-picking facts to suit the Republican author's message. I want to paraphrase one of our former colleagues here, my friend and mentor, Senator Patrick Moynihan. Everybody's entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. The American people should not be selectively presented with facts and deceived by a memo that amounts to character assassination, a memo that endangers our national security, compromises the sources and methods of our intelligence community, and has only the purpose of degrading and discrediting the FBI and our Department of Justice as they engage in a valid, necessary investigation through the Special Counsel of Russian collusion in the last campaign, with the campaign itself, electing Donald Trump, and potential obstruction of justice afterward. The hypocrisy and silence of many of my Republican colleagues in both houses is deeply disappointing. Now is the time for people of conscience to stand up and speak out in favor of the rule of law and know that the fate and future of our democracy depends on it. There will be a lot of rhetoric tonight in these halls. But what matters now is action to defend our democracy, and I am grateful to my very distinguished colleague for calling attention to the continued Russian meddling and interference in our democracy. Hashtag release the memo, which was retweeted 200,000% in a span of 48 hours and became the leading hashtag on Twitter, was spread by accounts associated with the Russian government or agents. House Republicans are playing right into the hands of the Russian. The President of the United States, defying the law, declines to impose sanctions, even after the overwhelming number of our colleagues here, 98-2, voted in favor of those sanctions. Why is it that Donald Trump is so much in thrall of Vladimir Putin and the Russians? Perhaps it is because of the last campaign, but they are continuing with their interference and meddling, and they will do it again in 2018. The CIA director, Mike Pompeo, said today that they will do it again, and indeed they will unless they are made to pay a price. The absence of sanctions speaks louder than my words. Mr. President, it's time for us to stand up and speak out, and I thank my colleague from the state of Rhode Island for being here today to join me.
Mr. President, not only to follow the words of my distinguished colleague from Connecticut, not only are House Republicans, to use his phrase, playing into the hands of the Russians, they're actually playing by the playbook of the Russians. If you understand the Russian information warfare, the Gerasimov doctrine, the way in which Russians, and before them Soviets, for years tried to poison the factual environment around them, and then you put that up against this scheme where you start with the selective release of classified material that the public can't get behind because the rest is classified, the false narrative that the ranking member has pointed out that creates, the partisan and peculiar process for getting there, the ignoring of warnings from their own national security officials about how bad this is, the convenient whipping up of all of this in far-right media at the same time, the amplification of that actually by Russian bots and other sources, and the fact that this is all pointed, not coincidentally, at the agency and officials who are engaged in investigating the Trump White House and the Trump campaign. It's so appallingly obvious that what the game is that is being played here, and it is stunning to me to follow on what Senator Blumenthal said, that we've heard nothing, at least I've heard nothing, perhaps the senator from Connecticut can illuminate further, but I've heard nothing from our Director of National Intelligence, D.N.I. Coates. I've heard nothing from our CIA Director, Director Pompeo. For how long has it been? Since the very foundation of the FISA court in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, it has been an essential defense of our intelligence community that they don't want release of the FISA court records. And now we have a partisan release that touches back to FISA applications that the Department of Justice has said is reckless, and where are they? It's kind of astonishing that the custodians of those secrets appear to have absolutely no concern about this partisan and peculiar selective release of classified information. And I'll echo another point that Senator Blumenthal made. This just happens to be happening at a time when the sanctions that we voted on by massive majorities, massive bipartisan majorities. I think if you stack the votes together, House and Senate, it was something like 515 to 5. I mean, it was an enormous bipartisan vote to sanction the Russians for what they've been doing. And that just went live. The president could impose those sanctions now, and yet he's not. He's not. What's the explanation? The only people that this president seems incapable of being tough on are Russians. It is a very unpleasant set of coincidences. And at the same time, here we are with the Republican leadership in the House and Republican leadership in the Senate, and virtually every law enforcement and national security official who has come before us saying, hey, yeah, they did attack our last election in 2016, and they're going to attack our next election in 2018. We are warned that a foreign intelligence service, a hostile foreign power, is going to attack our 2018 election. Where is the legislation to defend against that? Where is the markup of the legislation? Where is the effort to do what needs to be done to defend our democracy? Here we're just a few months out from the election now. We're 9 months out, right? If I've got the math right, from now to 9 months between here and there. Nothing. Why is it that whenever the Russians come up, it seems that the Republican Party has to go into complete stasis? Just roll right over. I offer those thoughts to the distinguished senator from Connecticut.
And I want to very quickly and simply emphasize a couple of those very important points, and maybe the overriding one is the need for action. The presiding officer has demonstrated repeatedly his convictions and conscience, and I want to say how much I have admired much of what he has done during his Senate career, and my hope is that others in this body will step forward and say, enough is enough. The FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, is a carefully crafted, bipartisan institution meant to protect our country against foreign threats that would destroy our democracy. The very kind of threats that Russia has mounted repeatedly against us. Its function is balanced by a concern about civil rights and civil liberties, which is why it is a court that must approve warrants for surveillance and searches. And its secrecy goes to the core of what it does, so that the agents and operatives and informants who are the sources of intelligence are protected. The House Intelligence Committee is about to trash that carefully crafted structure. They are about to release a memo that says, in effect, that court, that carefully crafted balance as a result of bipartisan work over many years involving many in this chamber, means nothing. We'll use it for the most gross partisan purposes. Partisan gutter politics and character assassination. A reminder of the darkest days of the McCarthy era, when similarly there was a contempt for basic fairness, which persisted until Senator McCarthy was asked, have you no sense of decency? We are at that moment now. But it is a moment that is dark for all of us in this democracy. It is a moment that should elicit our strongest impulses for decency and democracy. We know that the Special Counsel is proceeding with his investigation. We know that there is a need to protect that Special Counsel against firing and political interference. We know there's a need for legislation that is bipartisan, and the need is now. This use of the most gross partisan politics and tactics is proof positive that there is a need for this legislation. And my hope is that the president will, in fact, impose sanctions, that there will be a bipartisan outcry against this defiance of a 517-5 vote. In this body, a 98-2 vote, that there should be sanctions when there is this defiance of our interests by the Russian government. And rather than simply listing oligarchs from a Forbes magazine account, that there be real action and accountability. Certainly, the president has avoided the finding of significant transactions that is his duty under the law. We need people of conscience and convictions now to step forward at this historic moment. In speeches going forward, I hope that, again, the senator from Rhode Island, my friend and a leader in this body, can come to the floor and talk further about this issue. But for now, my hope is that the president will heed the advice he's received from his Department of Justice, but it's not really his, it is the nation's Department of Justice. His appointee, who has said that release of this memo would be extraordinarily reckless. It would be reckless, reprehensible, and irresponsible, and a defiance of the president's duty to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.